Have you ever stopped to consider that the Jesus of Nazareth, the very man worshipped by millions as a deity, never explicitly claimed to be God? Not once. This isn't some wild theory. It's hidden in plain sight within the sacred texts themselves. For centuries, theologians have woven intricate doctrines around this figure. But if Jesus truly intended to declare himself as God, why the ambiguity? Why not just say it outright? We're about to embark on a journey that challenges the bedrock of Christian belief. Stick with me until the end, and you'll see the Bible in a whole new light. Like and share this video to spread the word, and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Also, drop a comment below to share your thoughts. I read every single one. Now, let's get into the video. Let's dive into one of the most explosive passages, John 8 verse 58, often championed by Christians as definitive proof. Here, Jesus declares, "Before Abraham was, I am." Cryptic, right? Church tradition insists this is Jesus equating himself with the Old Testament God, who in Exodus 3 verse 14 proclaims, "I am who I am." But are we really going to hinge the claim of divinity on a two-word phrase, spoken in Greek, no less? And who decided that a first-century Jewish audience would interpret this as a divine proclamation? This is where it gets interesting. The Jews of that era weren't entangled in debates about the Trinity. They didn't even have a concept of it. Their shock at Jesus' words wasn't because they thought he was claiming to be God, but because he was audaciously challenging their core beliefs about Abraham and their relationship with the Almighty. Here's a historical twist. The New Testament was penned in Greek, but Jesus likely communicated in Aramaic or Hebrew when he uttered the phrase, "I am." It wasn't some magical declaration of godhood. It was a common expression in Semitic languages. Scholars point out that while the Greek ego eimi might carry echoes of God's name, in Aramaic or Hebrew, it simply doesn't pack the same theological punch. In other words, even if Jesus used the phrase, his audience wouldn't have jumped to, "Oh, he's claiming to be Yahweh." John's Gospel, written decades after Jesus' death, grapples with Jesus' true identity. It's the most theologically developed of the four, placing a heavy emphasis on Jesus' divine nature. Yet, even here, there's no clear-cut statement like, "I am God, worship me." Instead, we see stories, metaphors, and language that hint at something profound, but not necessarily a claim to be the universe's creator in human form. If Jesus truly aimed to make an unmistakable claim to divinity, he could have done so in ways that left zero room for doubt. He could have proclaimed, "I am Yahweh in the flesh," or "I am the God of your ancestors." But he didn't. Instead, he spoke in riddles, parables, and phrases open to interpretation. Why? Because his mission wasn't about making people worship him as God. It was about something else entirely. This passage in John 8 verse 58 has been wrenched from its historical, linguistic, and cultural context, twisted into a theological weapon to defend ideas that didn't even exist when Jesus walked the earth. The claim that before Abraham was, "I am," equates to a divine self-revelation isn't universally accepted, even among biblical scholars. Some argue it's a statement about Jesus' pre-existence, others about his role in God's plan. But here's the kicker. Even if Jesus was claiming pre-existence, that doesn't automatically make him God. Angels were believed to pre-exist humanity, and no one worships them as deities. Now, let's clear something up. The phrase, "the Son of Man," does not mean God. For centuries, preachers have twisted this term into something it's not. Yet Jesus himself used this title more than any other. It appears over 80 times in the Gospels. The term originates in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in Ezekiel, where God addresses the prophet as Son of Man, simply meaning human being. It emphasizes humanity, mortality, and the fragile nature of being a person. So, when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, it's not a cryptic claim to being God. It's a reminder of his humanity. He's identifying with the frailty and struggles of being human. But there's another layer. In Daniel 7 verses 13 to 14, the Son of Man is depicted as a figure who comes on the clouds of heaven and is given authority, glory, and a kingdom by the Ancient of Days. This vision has been interpreted as messianic, pointing to someone who would represent God's authority on earth. By using this title, Jesus wasn't saying, "I'm God." He was aligning himself with a role of divine authority and mission, but still distinct from the God who gives that authority. Here's where things get interesting. Jewish audiences of Jesus' time didn't expect their Messiah to be divine. They envisioned a human leader, an anointed one who would liberate them from oppression and restore justice. By calling himself the Son of Man, Jesus was likely tapping into this expectation, presenting himself as a figure chosen by God for a specific purpose. But divine? No, that wasn't even on their radar. Now, let's talk about the reaction to this title in the Gospels. In Mark 2, verse 10, Jesus says, "The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." This statement shocked his audience, not because they thought he was claiming to be God, but because only God, in their view, had the right to forgive sins. To them, Jesus wasn't acting as God but stepping into a divine role, a critical distinction. Claiming authority doesn't mean claiming divinity. Kings, judges, and prophets claimed God-given authority all the time in Jewish tradition. Fast forward to the early Christian community. As the movement grew, the title Son of Man started to take on layers of meaning that likely weren't present in Jesus' original usage. By the time the Gospels were written, decades after Jesus' death, his followers were interpreting his life and words in light of their belief in his resurrection. The Son of Man became a title laden with theological implications. But those implications didn't necessarily reflect what Jesus himself intended. It's also worth noting that Jesus used this title in contexts that emphasize suffering and humility. For instance, in Matthew 20 verse 28, he says, "The Son of Man came not to be served but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." That doesn't sound like a God demanding worship. It sounds like someone embracing a role of sacrifice and service, fully aware of the cost. And let's not forget the cultural backdrop. In the Greco-Roman world, the idea of gods walking among humans was common, but the Jewish tradition, which Jesus was steeped in, was fiercely monotheistic. Any suggestion that a human could be God would have been outright heretical. Jesus knew this. His choice to call himself the Son of Man wasn't a careless slip. It was deliberate. He wasn't claiming to be God. He was pointing to his mission, his humanity, and his alignment with God's plan, not his identity as God himself. In Matthew 14 verse 33, after Jesus walks on water and calms the storm, the disciples bow down and say, "Truly you are the Son of God." Similarly, in John 9 verse 38, after healing a blind man, the man says, "Lord, I believe," and worships him. On the surface, these actions seem straightforward, people bowing, calling him Lord, offering what looks like worship. But dig deeper, and you'll see there's more nuance here than meets the eye. In the ancient Jewish world, worship didn't exclusively mean recognizing someone as divine. The Greek word often translated as worship in the New Testament is proskuneo, which can also mean bowing down in reverence or paying homage to someone in authority. This wasn't reserved for God alone. People bowed to kings, prophets, and even angels as a sign of respect. So, when people bowed to Jesus or called him Lord, they weren't necessarily saying, "You are God." They were acknowledging his authority, his role, or even his miraculous powers. In Luke 7, a Roman centurion addresses Jesus as Lord, asking him to heal his servant. This term, Kyrios in Greek, was a common way to address someone with authority or respect. It didn't mean the centurion thought Jesus was Yahweh. It's the same word you'd use to address a master or superior. Context matters. And in most cases, these acts of worship were more about recognizing Jesus as a prophet, healer, or teacher, not as the Almighty God. Now, think about the culture Jesus lived in. The Jewish people were staunchly monotheistic. Worshipping anyone other than Yahweh was blasphemy of the highest order. If Jesus' followers genuinely believed he was God in the flesh, it would have caused an immediate, massive backlash, not just from religious leaders, but from the general population. Yet, We don't see that kind of widespread outrage recorded in the Gospels. Instead, the conflict is almost always about Jesus challenging religious norms, healing on the Sabbath, or claiming authority over traditions, not about him claiming to be God. Let's talk about another key moment often cited: Thomas's exclamation in John 20 verse 28, "My Lord and my God." This is frequently held up as definitive proof that Jesus' disciples believed he was divine. But even here, interpretation matters. Some scholars suggest Thomas's words were less about addressing Jesus directly as God and more about a moment of astonished realization, praising God for the resurrection. It's not a settled issue, and interpreting this as a blanket affirmation of Jesus' deity requires ignoring a lot of the context and nuance. And here's a historical twist. The idea that Jesus was worshipped as God didn't fully develop until decades after his death. Early Christian writings, like Paul's letters, often describe Jesus in exalted terms, but stop short of calling him God outright. Paul calls Jesus the image of the invisible God and speaks of his exaltation after the resurrection, but he never equates him directly with God the Father. The worship of Jesus as divine evolved gradually, influenced by theological debates and the merging of Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions. Think about how revolutionary this is. If the earliest followers of Jesus didn't see him as God but as God's chosen representative or Messiah, then the acts of worship recorded in the Gospels take on a completely different meaning. They weren't breaking their monotheistic beliefs. They were acknowledging Jesus as someone uniquely chosen and empowered by God. The belief in Jesus as God didn't come fully formed from the start. It evolved gradually, incrementally, and sometimes contentiously over decades. Early followers of Jesus didn't agree on who he was. Some saw him as a human prophet, others as a Messiah chosen by God, and only later did some begin to describe him as divine. The earliest Christians were Jewish, and Jewish theology is uncompromisingly monotheistic. For them, God is one, eternal, indivisible, and transcendent. The idea of a man being God in the flesh was not just unthinkable, it was blasphemous. When Jesus' followers began spreading his teachings after his death, their focus wasn't on proclaiming him as God. Instead, they emphasized his role as the Messiah, the anointed one sent by God to fulfill divine promises. Take the Apostle Paul, one of the earliest and most influential figures in Christianity. His letters, written decades before the Gospels, reveal how the first followers of Jesus viewed him. Paul exalts Jesus as the image of the invisible God, Colossians 1 verse 15, and speaks of his resurrection as proof of his divine appointment. But he never equates Jesus with God the Father. Instead, Paul consistently portrays Jesus as subordinate to God. In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 28, Paul explicitly states that after all things are subjected to Jesus, Jesus himself will be subjected to God. This hierarchy is a far cry from later doctrines that proclaim Jesus as co-equal with the Father. Then there's the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the four Gospels. In Mark's account, Jesus is depicted as a powerful prophet, healer, and teacher, but not as God. His divinity isn't even hinted at in the same way as later Gospels like John. Mark begins with Jesus' baptism, not a divine birth, and emphasizes his humanity throughout. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written later, start to elevate Jesus' status by including stories of a miraculous birth. But even here, the focus is on Jesus as God's chosen servant, not God himself. It's in the Gospel of John, written decades after Mark, where we first see a fully developed theology of Jesus as divine. John begins with the famous prologue, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This gospel represents a significant shift, reflecting theological developments that had been brewing for decades. By this time, the Christian movement was no longer exclusively Jewish. It had expanded into the Greco-Roman world, where the idea of divine beings walking among humans was more culturally acceptable. The influence of Greco-Roman thought cannot be overstated. In the Greco-Roman pantheon, gods and demigods frequently interacted with humans, sometimes even taking on human form. As Christianity spread into these cultures, Its portrayal of Jesus began to absorb elements of this worldview. The concept of Jesus as a divine figure made sense to a Greco-Roman audience in a way that it never could have to a strictly Jewish one. The real turning point came in the centuries after Jesus' death, as debate over his nature became increasingly heated. Groups like the Ebionites saw Jesus as a human prophet chosen by God, while others, like the Gnostics, viewed him as a divine being who only appeared human. The Arian controversy of the 4th century was one of the most significant battles in early Christian theology. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was not eternal or equal to God but a created being, a view that was hugely popular in its time. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under the sponsorship of Emperor Constantine, that the Church officially declared Jesus to be of the same substance as God. But make no mistake, this was a political decision as much as a theological one. Constantine wanted to unify his empire under a single, cohesive doctrine, and the idea of Jesus as divine served that purpose. The Nicene Creed, which emerged from this council, was a product of compromise and debate, not a direct reflection of what Jesus or his earliest followers believed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is where everything took a dramatic turn. Organized by Emperor Constantine, this council was not about theological purity. It was about political unity. Constantine had recently converted to Christianity and saw the growing religion as a tool to unify his empire. But there was a problem. Christians couldn't agree on who Jesus was. At the center of this debate was a priest named Arius, who argued that Jesus was not eternal but a created being, an incredibly exalted one, but not God. His view wasn't a fringe opinion. It was widespread and well-supported, especially in the eastern parts of the empire. The other side, led by Athanasius of Alexandria, argued that Jesus was of the same essence as God the Father, co-eternal, co-equal, and fully divine. This wasn't a settled belief at the time. It was one perspective among many, but Constantine wasn't interested in theological nuance. He needed a unified doctrine to stabilize his empire, and he threw his weight behind Athanasius's side. The result was the Nicene Creed, a statement declaring that Jesus was begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. This wasn't a divine revelation. It was a political compromise. Many bishops who supported Arius's views were coerced or exiled. Others reluctantly signed the creed under pressure. But here's the kicker. Even after Nicaea, the debate didn't end. For decades, the Church swung back and forth between Arian and Nicene positions, with emperors favoring one side or the other depending on their political goals. I hope this deep dive into the complexities of Jesus' identity has been enlightening. Remember, it's crucial to question and explore these topics with an open mind. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video to keep the conversation going. Your engagement helps spread the word and brings more perspectives to light.